Welcome everyone. I'm Nick Torres, and so you probably got the invitation from the Social Innovations Journal Institute and Lab. So we just want to welcome you to this. It's been great kind of putting together this with Claire and Morgan. What we have planned today is really just, we've divided this into three sections. One is we're just going to do a quick welcome and introductions about who we are and why we're presenting on our respective parts. Then Claire is going to really dive into a little bit about what is an organizational theory of change, the framing and context. I will then do your measuring your organizational social impact component, really looking at board governance and leadership dashboards. And then Morgan will take it over there from moving the theory to practice for mobile engagement. So Claire, would you like to do the first introduction and then we'll kick it back to you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I know some of the folks that are on this session, some of the names look familiar, but for those of you that I don't know, my name is Claire Robertson-Kraft, and I'm the founder and executive director of Impact Ed. We're a center based out of the University of Pennsylvania's School of Liberal and Professional Studies, and our mission is to empower leaders with critical skills and data to accelerate social change. But if you told me when I was younger that I would be running an organization focused on data, I wouldn't have believed you, because my passion has always been working with people, not with numbers. I began my career as a third grade teacher with Teach for America, and then worked in a variety of nonprofit and public sector roles. And in each one of these roles, I saw the same thing. Which is that there are countless leaders working tirelessly to have an impact in their communities. You just think about what we've seen over the last few weeks in response to the current crisis. Yet many of those leaders leave work, as I did when I was a nonprofit leader, worrying that their best efforts might not have been enough. And so in the nonprofit and public sector, what I see is that it's really hard to know if what you're doing is working and how to allocate scarce resources to make the most difference for the communities that you're working with. So after getting my Ph.D., I founded Impact Ed to help organizations wrestle with those issues. And so we're gonna share a little bit more about the work that we do as we get into the presentation today. But we believe that it's really passion plus data that will accelerate social change.
Morgan?
Hi everyone, I'm Morgan Berman. I'm the founder and CEO of Milk Crate, and my passion, kind of like Claire's, has evolved over the years, but I started in the nonprofit world. I was working as a case manager for low-income women, and then I also worked in reproductive health care. And one of the things that, like Claire said, I saw was that desire to use resources more effectively and efficiently, and my passion for technology started to lead to a path where I created a platform and a company that helps nonprofits use their limited resources in a way that helps them be more efficient and effective. And specifically what we do is we help nonprofits launch mobile apps so that they can better engage the people that they're serving, do better outreach, better engagement, and better tracking of those program participants, whether they're volunteers, beneficiaries, or students, so that you can actually see in real time what are people engaging with, what are they doing, so you can have the data to report back to your funders and your stakeholders to show this quarter we got this many volunteers do this much work and this was the need that it filled, or we got this many kids to check into this many museums and that's an X-fold increase from last year. So that's the thing that I've become really kind of passionate about, is that blend between design, technology, and helping nonprofit programs be more efficient and effective.
And I'm Nick Torres. Most people know me through the Social Innovations Journal Institute and Lab. But I would think what I'm talking today about is most of my work was prior to that, when I was running Congreso, and in 2008 to 2010, we did a intense theory of change that really changed how I looked at nonprofits and how they should be governed and managed. And then I took a lot of that knowledge and have been teaching out of Fels Institute of Government and the Social Policy School of Penn, and really helping shape how nonprofits can be using developing social impact dashboards or metrics, scorecards or so. So using a theory of change, but really translating it into actual documents people can use. So with that, I think we're going to turn it over to Claire. So Claire.
Great, thanks Nick. I'm gonna do some fancy sharing of the screen. Okay.
Oh, and I will say, while Claire's getting this up, is we thought we'd approach, since there's a lot of people on this one, we thought if you have questions, it's probably best to submit them in the chat box. That way we can respond to them in a written format while other people are talking. But if you have something to contribute, there should be a little blue hand on the bottom of your screen, and you can raise your hand, and that way we know to call on you, and then you can contribute to the conversation when we get to those questions. Thanks.
Great. So thanks, Nick. So as Nick shared, I'm going to provide some framing and context to set the stage for our conversation today about theory of change and measurement. And I know the term theory of change gets thrown around a lot. So what exactly is it? Well, a theory of change is a tool to help organizations understand the change that they're seeking to achieve in the world. And it structures strategic thinking and provides a platform to understand and measure results for both learning and improvement purposes. And a strong theory of change, as we've seen from our work, is the foundation of strong organizations and programs. And ultimately, the whole purpose is to ensure positive impacts for the beneficiaries of the services themselves. So when we work with organizations to help them develop theories of change, we often hear the question, like, why do we actually need a theory of change? We already have a mission statement. We already have a vision statement. It's not the same thing. We already have all of these things that we've done throughout our strategic planning process. And so when I get asked that question, my answer to it is to share my favorite cartoon, which some of you may have seen already. Let me pop it out here. So an organization may indeed have a vision statement, right, which represents what you see here on the right side of this this visual, like the algebra looking equation. And in other words, that means you know the ultimate goal of what you're working to achieve. And an organization also knows what it is that they do. So if you look on the left-hand side here of the cartoon, you can see here whether that's a fraction or whatever that might be. You know what it is that you're doing, and you know what it is ultimately that you're working towards. But if an organization doesn't have a strong theory of change, then there's a resulting disconnect or gap between the long-term strategy and the daily operations. And so this can create organizations that work hard but not well, operate efficiently but not effectively, or the inverse, are productive but don't come close to getting the results that they expect or are working to achieve, and organizations that fail to learn from what they're doing despite their best efforts. And so a theory of change addresses these issues by connecting an organization's motivating thoughts and what their dreams and aspirations are with the actual hard facts of its performance. And so a strong theory of change provides a blueprint for getting performance to match intentions. So you can think of a theory of change, another way of thinking about it is it describes an organization's what, their why, and their how. So one of my favorite quotes that I like to share when I think about theory of change work is from Yogi Berra, who in addition to being a baseball player was actually pretty good with words. And he said, if you don't know where you're going, how are you gonna know when you get there? So at its core, a theory of change is a North Star for an organization, guiding strategic choices about where an organization is best positioned to have an impact, which I've been thinking a lot about in the current circumstances that we find ourselves in, because that's just so critically important to have that kind of a North Star. And it maps out then what an organization thinks about that impact or change, you know, what progress and success looks like along the way, and ultimately, what is it going to take to get there, to realize that vision or that North Star? So it's like a roadmap that outlines the change and all of the conditions that are needed to bring about that change. So at its core, sort of, that is, if you weren't familiar with the term, that is how define what a theory of change is. So if you're not convinced about the value of a theory of change just from listening to me, I wanted to play a short video of two leaders that we have worked with in one of the programs that we run, and have them share some of their experience about building a theory of change and what that was like for their organization. So you're going to hear from Milani Cataldi, who works at Philabundance, and Jean Marie Hagan, who works at Women Against Abuse. And you'll hear from them both the benefits and also the challenges associated with developing a theory of change. So just before I pull it up, a quick check. Are you guys looking at the video now?
Yes.
All right, so I'm good with Zoom. Thank you.
My name is Milani Cataldi, and I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Philabundance. Philabundance is actually the region's largest anti-hunger organization. When we started this process, we knew that Philabundance was going to transform as an organization, but we didn't know what the road path was going to be to expand our mission. So we were hopeful that in this process, we would learn about different types of data, when to use it, how to collect it, how to share it, and really build a path to help us expand our mission.
My name is Jean Marie Hagan, and I'm from Women Against Abuse. Women Against Abuse provides quality programs to victims of domestic violence, and we participate in advocacy to lead the struggle against domestic violence. We were at the point where we were collecting everything and didn't have a lot of clarity. And we really felt like we had some great outcomes, but everyone felt like all of the outcomes were important, which meant none of them were important, and we had no real priorities. So we thought that engaging in this type of work would help us give us the clarity and direction to really be able to prove and discuss our impact.
A theory of change helps organizations understand ultimately what's the change they want to achieve in the world. It functions like a North Star, asking organizations to consider where are they headed and how are they going to get there. So it's a strategic blueprint that organizations can use to really begin to understand and unpack the impact that they want to have and determine how all of the programs and services they offer are in service of that ultimate change.
One of the most important things that the theory of change did was empower staff with language to know how this work can work. Starting the process, a lot of staff had an intuitive feeling of where we needed to go, but to be able to have the language and say, this is how others have done it, and this is what it might look like, and here are the steps, gave us the path to bring everybody along with us. We did not expect it to be as hard as it was. When we started out, we were talking about data, and that seems so transactional. But when we started to talk about doing a theory of change, we really were talking about who is the organization, what do we want to become, and what does success look like when we get there? Those are big, hairy questions that we really had to work through.
Well, I approached the theory of change with the idea that it would help clarify the numerous outcomes that we all thought were important, but really muddled the conversation around our demonstrating our impact. We worked with a coach that really helped us navigate really tough conversations within the organization. The theory of change really challenged our assumptions of best practices or why we do the things that we do, or really fundamentally, the question that kept coming up for us is, do we want to do more for less people or less for more people? The breadth versus depth conversation was a really tricky conversation for the organization.
So organizations that need to do this type of work, theory of change work, I think they need to know that there's a pretty big investment in staff time and that there has to be leadership buy-in. Because again, if you're looking at doing a theory of change, you're talking about changing something, a program, an organization, the way you work. There's got to be leadership buy-in and the ability and authority to drive that change.
The theory of change conversations that we had at a leadership level were challenging and tough and philosophical, and also at the end rewarding. We made sure that we were clear about who had decision-making power within the organization, which clarified when we were getting feedback from staff, from directors, from programs, that who ultimately had the decision about what we were going to move forward with the theory of change. And that I think ultimately helped us in the end. The theory of change process was really important to us, that it has been able to help us communicate what our impact can be with our clients and communities. For the first time ever this last year, we were able to align what our data collection with our outcomes and our communication at the end of the year about what we do.
All right. Are you guys looking at my screen again? Okay, great. So that video hopefully gives you a sense of what the process of developing a theory of change is like, what it feels like for an organization, what it can look like for an organization, both what is inspiring about that process and also what is really challenging from the perspective of a few of the clients that we've worked with. So from Milani at Philabundance, you heard what we often hear from organizations, that the theory of change process provides a way to really think about strategy in a different way. And so for Philabundance, they built out a new pillar of their work as part of the theory of change process, not just focused on relieving hunger now, but on ending hunger for good. And this means that Philabundance isn't just focused on food distribution, which they obviously still are, but as they, are also thinking about the strategy moving forward, it's about partnering with other organizations that offer a range of services to really address and get at other critical issues that are affecting food insecurity. And so this has led to a new series of innovative pilots that they're a part of with organizations across the region, like Habitat for Humanity, for example. And from Jean Marie at Women Against Abuse, you heard that they used the theory of change work to clarify what the most important outcomes were and to create a common language in the organization where there's alignment, which, as she shared, is definitely challenging, but can also be very rewarding in the long term. And Women Against Abuse used the theory of change process to align all of the data collection that they did with the outcomes, and then also to provide a clearer way to communicate with stakeholders, both internal to the organization and external, about what it is that they do. And so across both organizations, the theory of change served as a foundation for measurement, evaluation, and learning. And you're going to hear a little bit more from Nick and Morgan later in this webinar about measurement and evaluation. And the theory of change can really be a strong foundation for helping establish a plan for that, and also thinking about how you can measure your progress along the way. So hopefully you're convinced, either because you were already convinced when you joined this webinar, or the video convinced you that this process can be worth it. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time now talking about the characteristics of what makes a good theory of change. So first, a theory of change should be meaningful. Second, it should be plausible. Third, it should be doable. And finally, it should be testable. So I'm going to walk through and talk about each one of these characteristics of a strong theory of change. And I'm going to use Philabundance's theory of change, you heard from Milani in the video, as an example to kind of illustrate what a theory of change looks like and what I mean by these criteria. So first, you want to think about how do you ensure that a theory of change is meaningful? And so a theory of change should represent the most important aspects of what an organization is working to achieve. And I actually find the word theory to be a bit misleading at times, because it makes it sound overly academic, like something you would read in a textbook, when really a strong theory of change should be informed by the needs and voices of the beneficiaries that you're working with. And that's always been the case when developing a theory of change, but I think it's even more critical now in the times that we find ourselves in to ask yourself the question, how is this theory of change being responsive to the needs of the constituents that we're working with? And that's just a critical foundational question. It's meaningful for the people that you're working with. And so let's look at Philabundance's theory of change, which you heard Milani talk about as an example. Now, I know there's a lot going on this slide, and I'm going to walk through it in pieces as we go through the different characteristics. But for now, I just wanted to direct your attention to the things that I've blocked off or boxed out in blue. So the first part at the top is the intended impact. That's the North Star, right? Ending hunger for good. Now, this impact should inspire people about the change the organization is trying to create. And in this case, I don't know about all of you, but I find that impact of ending hunger for good pretty inspiring, particularly in light of our current crisis. And so that's at the top of the theory of change, is the intended impact. And then what you see here along the right side, which I've boxed in blue, is information on the target population and how Philabundance is thinking about the needs of the constituents that they're serving, and how those needs and experiences shift over time, from crisis to vulnerable, to safe, to stable, to thriving. And so again, it's important to think about the change being meaningful for the constituents that you're working with. So that's the first aspect of a theory of change, is that you want it to be meaningful and reflective of the stakeholders that you work with. Next, you want to ensure that a theory of change is plausible, so that the services you're offering are likely to lead to the impact, and that there's research and evidence to support these linkages. So on Philabundance's theory of change, you can see that they have 5 pillars: food, housing, health, financial, and employment. And so the first question of plausibility is whether these 5 pillars are sufficient to end hunger for good. And then it's a question of looking within each pillar. So take the first pillar I've highlighted in blue, related to food security, as an example. The question is to ask what needs to be offered in terms of support in order to lead to the changes and outcomes over time here, from people not having enough to eat all the way to having the kinds of food that they wanted. And then you'd ask the same set of questions in each pillar. And you can see some of the activities listed at the bottom here of the theory of change: community engagement, stability coaching, collaborative intervention. So there's a lot of research that went into this theory of change. Obviously can't be depicted in the visual, and I'm not going to go through now, but that Philabundance did to ensure that the theory is plausible. And that's what's informing how they think about the types of partnerships that they'll establish as a result. So next, you want to think about whether or not the theory of change is doable. And so this means considering whether you have the resources needed to execute on the programs and services that you've outlined. And this question of doability is particularly important in the current context, where there is increasing need and sometimes limited resources to meet that need. So this is one of the tensions in the theory of change process, is that you want to be aspirational when developing a theory of change, but you also want to be realistic about what's actually doable to accomplish in the circumstances. So in the Philabundance example, this set of food, housing, health, financial, and employment services, and then the activities laid out here at the bottom of the theory of change, are actually not doable for Philabundance to achieve alone, but they need to partner with other organizations to execute. And so this is an example theory of change of a collective impact approach. So Philabundance needs to ask, what can they do? And then what resources and partnerships do they need to execute this theory? And so some of you may be engaged in collective impact work, but I imagine that many of you are not. So if you're not, you would ask the same set of questions just about what your organization does alone. So in other words, what's doable in terms of the services that you offer, given the resources that you have? And as a result of that, what does that mean you can actually accomplish over time? And finally, a strong theory of change should be testable. So as I shared, and Nick and Morgan will talk more too, a theory of change is the foundation for measurement, evaluation, and learning. And you want to think not just about how you can measure program quality or implementation through what are called outputs, but also about how you can measure progress over time through outcomes. And so this is the step 2 of that cartoon I shared earlier, which is my favorite cartoon about connecting strategy to operations. So finally, let's look at what I would refer to as Philabundance's step 2, connecting their operations with their ultimate goal. And so you can see here for each area of their work, they have defined short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes of what change will look like over time for the constituents that they're working with. And this part of the work really involves thinking about what's most critical for the constituents you're working with, and then what are the steps that you'll hold yourself accountable to along the way as you work towards achieving whatever your ultimate impact is. So I know there's a lot going on this slide, so I'll just give people just a minute or a few seconds to kind of to look over it, and then we'll kind of go to the next slide. And fancy Zoom, you could give me like a thumbs up or something like that, right? If you're ready to move on, or I'll just give folks a minute. All right, so I know a lot of information on this slide, trying to give you a flavor for what this work looks like in practice through a concrete example, and can see here the aspects of a theory of change. How is it meaningful? How is it plausible, doable, and testable are all kind of things to consider when building this out. So anyone that knows me knows I love working with organizations to develop theories of change, but I also want to acknowledge that this is really hard work. And we tell organizations that participate in our processes to trust the process. And so I wanted to just share a little bit about the process with you before I stop to take any questions, and then turn it over to Nick to talk a little bit more about measurement. So this is just the process at a very high level. These are the stages that you go through when you think about building a theory of change. You want to start broad and think big, right? What impact will your organization hold yourself accountable to achieving? That's your North Star, your intended impact. And then you want to consider what are the outcomes along the way that you'll track to see if you are on track towards achieving that long-term impact. And then finally, what are the core components of your work? In other words, what are your most critical programs and services, and how do they meet the needs of the constituents that you're working with and help you realize the intended impact that you want to have for them? So these are some questions, what impact you'll hold yourself accountable to, how you capture change along the way, and then what are your core components and services that you can begin to think about if you're interested in building a theory of change, or if you have a theory of change that you can use for refining it. And if you're interested in going deeper, this type of support is the type of support that we provide at Impact Ed. So we have worked with dozens of organizations in the region, some of which are actually on the call today, to help them develop theories of change, and then to think about how to collect and use data on their outcomes to inform their program and organizational improvement. So just a little bit about Impact Ed before I see if there are any questions, and then pitch it over to Nick. We offer two types of services, research and evaluation services and learning and development services. And in our research and evaluation services, we help organizations do what I just described, right? Develop an organizational theory of change or a strategy, and then think about how to collect and analyze data to inform action to help them achieve that strategy. In our learning and development services, we run two training programs, one for organizations funded by the William Penn Foundation called the Social Impact Collaborative, and one funded for organizations funded by the Pew Fund called the Evaluation Capacity Building Initiative, or ECBI. Clearly every good program needs an acronym, so SIC and ECBI. And then for organizations that aren't funded by one of these two foundations, we also run individual trainings and do leadership development for local nonprofits and public sector agencies that are interested in building capacity to do this type of work internally. So I will stop there and see if there are any questions. Like Nick said, if you have questions and you want to type them into the chat, you can do it that way. If you want to share some thoughts and you want to raise your hand, we can call on anybody that's here to kind of share an insight. So we'll give folks a few minutes before we kind of move into the next part of the presentation.
So Claire, I'll help with this on the chat box. So your first question is on the fill abundance chart. The first question is, why are the outcomes and measures at the end of the arrow? If you want to go back to that slide, and then can help you with the next question.
Great, thanks. I see that I didn't have my chat up, so there were questions coming in as we go, but that's good. Nick has been monitoring it. Sorry, can you say this one more time, Nick?
So why are the outcomes and measures at the end of the arrow?
At the end of the
People
arrow.
talking to the pathway to sustainability, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so these are the outcomes here. This like the green, like the green, yellow, orange, blue, and red. These are the outcomes over time in each one of the areas. And I think this over here, this pathway to stability, if that's what the question meant about the arrow, that's just like a kind of a visual cue that's trying to show that there is like short to medium to long term. That's just their kind of way of like explaining what the chart is. I think I'm answering the question, but these are the outcomes here, kind of like from short to medium to long.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, usually the outcomes are sort of the end of it, but visually people can represent it graphically in many different ways. So
yeah, and actually that's a really important point. Can I stay on that for just a minute, Nick? Because I know some people that like might look at a chart like this and say there's like too much going on, right? We want a theory of change that is like more streamlined. And Phil Abundance actually does have like 3 different visual representations of their theory of change that they use for different audiences. I used this one today because I think it's a good example of like detailed each level, so you can see what we're talking about with outcomes, which is what Nick's going to talk about more in a minute. But they also have a higher level, less information that has this like pathway over to the side that I think actually like visually is a little bit like easier to access, and maybe something that they use for their you know, for different audiences, like external audiences that don't need all of this detail. So like a theory of change can be visualized in lots of different ways and be lots of different formats, depending on who your audience is and what you're trying to communicate and the level of information you think they need.
So the next question you have, Claire, is what to do when there's a major gap in research to back up how conditions are linked to specific outcomes?
Yeah, what a great question. And that is not, you know, there are places where there are gaps in the research, and there are places there are gaps in this theory of change, to be frank, where like they did a lot of research, but it's, you know, there's some unknowns here about how these services work together to achieve certain outcomes and where that synergy is. And so the best answer that I have for that question is to make your own research. And to collect your own data and learn internally from the work that you're doing, like piloting different things and learning in real time to collect data to test your own theory and kind of build your own research base. And then in general, like, you know, I know nonprofits don't have time to like sit around and go through academic articles and see if research is coming out. So I think partnerships with local universities or national universities, like having a research partner that can help you kind of like stay connected to the academic work that might be happening in other places is also really helpful.
So your next question, so what, Claire, what pointers would you offer to very small groups? I assume nonprofits, but maybe not, even those who are unfunded, how to get started without resources?
How to get started with developing a theory of change. Yep. And this is, we work with, I would just say, we've worked with organizations to develop theories of change that are much larger, organizations like Phil Abundance, and also smaller organizations. And we have often found that smaller organizations can be quite nimble in doing this work because they are, whether they're earlier stage or they have like a more core set of stakeholders, that sometimes like a smaller size can be an advantage in really being able to like pivot and be innovative in thinking about your approach. So that's just a note on smaller organizations. And then I would say you don't have to overcomplicate it, right? If looking at something like this for a starting point feels like just too much information to try to lay out all at once, you can start from this set of questions that I shared here. This three core questions, right? What impact are you holding yourself accountable to achieving? How will you capture outcomes along the way? And maybe it's not as many layers as I just showed. It's some core outcomes and really focusing on what, given your size, you think is feasible. And then what are your core components? And like, even if it's a high level map of that, like starting from something like that, that's accessible and doable, and then collecting information and learning from that information to fill in some of the details, I think is important. So there are lots of different levels and depth of theories of change out there that you can work from. And I've found even ones that are just pretty high level can be still very helpful as an orienting document for an organization.
And Stanley, my presentation is really focused on some nuts and bolts of how you may start that. So it aligns very closely with Claire's. So the next question is, I've seen nonprofits translate their theory of change into a pithy statement, something like end hunger for good by XXX. Can you speak to how this is done or how some of your clients have done this?
Got it. So so this is a really interesting question. So how did Phil Abundance come up with this ending hunger for good, which is, I think, an example of like a clear kind of short statement. I can't tell you actually how many versions there were before they landed on ending hunger for good. And so how they did it was by gathering feedback. They had a couple of different versions over time of like how they wanted to capture it. And they gathered feedback from different stakeholder groups, from the board, from partners. I think they might have even talked to some media. I'm not sure, but like people that like covered the sector to say like, what do people think would resonate, to internal staff, like, so a variety of different stakeholder groups to see what would resonate most. And that this is what they landed on, but I only chuckle because, like, as both Jean Marie and Milani said in the video, like, it's really this work involves a lot of different stakeholders and involving people in those conversations, and it's different for every organization. So I think my advice in general is like to think about the dynamics within your organization. Who are the key stakeholders, right? That their perspective is really important to informing whatever choices you make. And then how are you also going to come to a place, I think it was Jean Marie who said it, though I think Milani would say the same thing, where you're going to make a decision. Like, how are you going to decide when there are different perspectives that we've gathered enough input and we've got the feedback, right? And this is the path forward. So the answer to the question about how did they come up with that was through a lot of like stakeholder feedback and testing of different, and not just that statement, but of actually the whole theory of change went through what we call a pressure testing process.
So I think the last question we have for you, Claire, and this might be more on Morgan's side of it, but the question is, do you have recommendations on software or apps for authoring, adapting, communicating theories of change?
Well, I'll definitely be touching on the app stuff in a little bit.
Got it. And does that for communicating? This is one of those things that's great to have three presenters. I can just pitch that question to Morgan, but here's one thing I will say, for like low tech, like if the question is also about like, how do you create a visual, which I don't think it is. I think it's about a bit more things Morgan will talk about with software apps. But there are a lot of great free tools out there that you can build visuals in that are a little bit more sophisticated than PowerPoint. The one that I like to use is called Lucid Chart. I can put it in the chat, but there are a lot of different kinds of examples out there. And so you don't have to be a graphic designer or an expert media person to create like a visual that can be compelling. But I will let Morgan handle more of the tech question. I see actually Farah, sorry, can I take the, Nick, I think there was a clarification how they will. Oh, I see. So Farah's question was less about how to make the ending vision pithy, but the how they will end. Yeah, so, and that goes back to what I was sharing a bit before about like, sometimes, when people look at this visual, there's just a lot going on. It's not, I wouldn't describe each one of these outcomes like that. What I have in blue here is particularly pithy. The like higher level version of this theory of change really actually mostly, if I'm remembering correctly, has what you see on the right side here, the pathway to stability. And it talks about movement from in crisis to vulnerable to safe to stable to thriving. And it doesn't have like all of the different outcomes at each level. It has like a higher level statement of what it means to be vulnerable versus safe, stable, and thriving. I'm not sure I would describe it yet as like pithy, right? Or like, but it's kind of capturing, again, it's trying to capture kind of a core description of what that change looks like over time. So I think folks that are interested, I have many different examples of organizations' theories of change that I am happy to share. The ones many have given me permission to share, right, their theories of change. I'm happy to provide some different examples if people want to follow up after, just to see how some different groups have approached it.
So we're going to shift on to Morgan. Did you want to answer the question about the technology?
I think, why don't we because I'm going to talk so much about apps and technology in a little bit. Why don't we do that? And then we can, if there's still a question, we can come back to it then.
Okay. And you guys can see mine, correct? My screen, social innovations?
Yep.
Okay. So, so again, I'm Nick Torres, and I'm going to give you a little context of how this presentation has been informed. But back in 1998, when I was running Congreso, we had Ed McConnell Clark come into our organization, and they were accompanied by David Hunter, and they started asking us what was the theory of change. So we sort of shifted or pivoted our organization to be somewhat of an anti-poverty social mobility organization, because that was what held everything together. But I think more importantly to that, to feed off of what Claire was doing, is once we had that, we had to figure out how to measure that impact. And I go into the importance of measuring your social impact is oftentimes nonprofits, especially boards, get criticized because they aren't necessarily governing on the social impact framework. Oftentimes we may have good governance in terms of financials and strategy, but we lack these social impact or dashboards or scorecards. So it really takes what Claire was saying is once you develop that theory of change, you move it into something concrete that can be used to gather data and use that data to inform your next stages. So, you know, the step one, and a lot of this was informed by David Hunter's work. But adapted a little bit throughout the years. And then at the end of this presentation, I'll give you a couple examples that we had at Congreso, and then another one, which is a different organization, but the Free Library, which took a sort of a different tack to measuring social impact. But, you know, as we look at this first question, and Claire had mentioned it, is the first is the target population. You know, that is, you know, who are you really trying to serve? And for us, that was a really hard organization because we, in a sense, said, we're open to anybody who walks through our doors, but it prevented us from being focused and saying, and without that focus, it was really hard to develop programs or services that really had that potential impact that we really wanted them to do that. And so we had to go through this process and, in a sense, narrow down who we wanted to do it, who we wanted to focus on. So the question, and, you know, I just really wanted to open this up to the group and say, you know, what are you thinking in terms of this? But, you know, the question is, like, assuming you had limited resources, and we all know that nonprofits do have limited resources, what criteria would you use to determine who gets and who does not get your services? You know, an example that nobody really likes, but was the, you know, you're like, for example, like the Titanic, you're on the ocean and you only have so many lifeboats. Well, who gets to get in the lifeboat? But not exactly who gets to, but what's your criteria for making that decision? You know, we had lots of internal discussions about, well, of course we have to save anybody, but the reality is we do have limited resources. And then the second question for really narrowing down your target population is, can you talk about who you want to serve by the geographic location? Is it by gender? Is it race, ethnicity? Is it age, a socioeconomic status? But just going through this exercise and really having these discussions, both at a program level, but also at the board level, really allows you to really focus that theory of change that Claire was talking about. So before you have to answer these questions. So I want to stop there for a little bit and just kind of hear people's thoughts and questions of your own organizations, of how would you go about this, of saying who's your target populations and what process might work. And Claire, feel free to jump in and say, you know, how deep do you go into this with organizations before you guys launch into a theory of change?
Sorry, I was muted. I thought you were going to ask me to call on people that I are in the programs that we run that should be able to answer this question. No, but you know who you are. I won't call on you, but some people have like wrestled with this. And yeah, I think target population is essential for this question. And I think I said, in my presentation, even more so now to really understand like, what are the needs of the constituents that you're serving? Who are you serving? And how can you ensure that that what you provide aligns to those needs? I think it's critical. So the target population is from the very beginning of our process, like a critical question and something that people wrestle with and continue to come back to.
I'll jump in.
I was going to call on you, John.
I'm with Senior Community Services in Delaware County, and our target population is very well defined as people who live in Delaware County and who are 60 or older. You can go one step beyond that to their adult children, families, caregivers, but we're focused on that 60 plus population.
And making that decision was, again, most nonprofits I found do not engage in this conversation, but I think it's such an important conversation to just have, and then you result that, as I think John said, you result at your answer. Some single track organizations are very focused on that, but for example, we at Congreso said, well, we're supposed to focus on the Latino community, but what we really found was, well, are we more geographically based, or are we only focused on the community? And the reality is we weren't, and so we had to define our boundaries first, and then whoever lived in those particular boundaries. We also had this question of like, are we focused on all ages of the population from 0 to 99, or did we have a sweet spot? And we really said, yes, we did serve anybody, but our sweet spot was 16 to 24-year-olds. And again, we never were able to articulate that until we had these conversations, and then ultimately made a decision of that. But because of that, it focused the organizations. And then when we had to go make hard decisions, we had criteria to make those decisions. And I see from Miranda is like Caribbean people. I think that's great. But Miranda, I would almost say is like you dig a little deeper and say geographically based, ages and stuff. That just provides a little bit more discipline. So let's move on just to the next one. Again. So the step 2 is really, and this gets a little bit more in detail to what Claire was talking about, is like, okay, so just define and codify your organization's outcomes. What's the measurable value to that? But more likely than not, you'll end up with indicators, the indicators that will indicate, or the evidence that you will ultimately reach your outcome. An example of this as well, an outcome we might say is like, we're graduating kids from high school or from college, but the reality is we might only see them for a year or two before they move out of our program or into something else. So we have to take indicators such as literacy, third grade or fourth grade reading level that indicates that they're more likely to graduate from high school. So again, we have outcomes, but we might have to resort to those indicators that indicate that we've achieved our goal. So this is a slide from Claire, which is great, which was really, what's the difference between an output and an outcome? And again, when we started at Congreso, is we only really report on outputs, and we were very proud of our outputs. Like we served 15,000 people, we were all doing good work, and and we were good at counting numbers. And then we did have all these logic models per program, and it was program by program that started measuring their particular outcomes, but we didn't have it organizationally. And so when we started moving to outcomes, we realized it was much harder to track, but so much more important to track to ultimately know if we are changing people's lives. And then, this also says, there's different types of outcomes, and I'm going to jump into these in a little bit more detail, but you could frame in between a short-term, medium-term, or a long-term outcome. And this is more of a framework for those particular things, but I'll jump into detail a little bit. This is just a considered change over time. So the two things that we usually do is imagine the scenario as you need to assemble a component of your board, staff at all different levels, and you have this brainstorming session. And really to say is anything goes, and the process is to list anything that anybody thinks is important to measure. And they could be outputs, they could be outcomes, just anything really goes on that particular board, because you want to do a comprehensive look at the organization to say which ones do we want to measure. But then there's a process of like, how do you narrow it down? And Claire mentioned this before, but we said, you know, can you measure the output or outcome? So some people would say is like, well, we want people to be happy, right? And it was like, well, can you measure it? I said, of course you can measure it, and there are measurement systems to do that, but most people cross that off the list because they don't have the resources to measure it, right? And so you go through this process, listed outcome or indicator or outcome one by one, and you really ask this question: can we measure it within the resources we have? And that process will narrow it down to hopefully, you know, 3, maybe 5, maybe 15 measures that you are going to hold yourself accountable to. At Congreso, we started off with 89, and then we narrowed it down to about 18. The consultants, David Hunter and Edmund Clark Foundation, said that was probably too many, but we were a very complex organization. Now I've done this about 10 years with lots of mock nonprofits and some real nonprofits, but usually they end up with about 3 to 7 concrete things that they can measure. The second question asked her is like, you know, will you hold yourself publicly accountable to these particular measures? I think it's really just a check to say is like, are you really going to move forward with this? You know, and because you know, we say it's like, it's going to end up in the newspaper and the whole world's going to know about that. When we first did this process and we narrowed it down to those outcomes, we measured them for that first year, what we realized is we had a lot of money, but we weren't necessarily delivering upon the outcomes that we cared about, which was moving people up the social mobility ladder out of poverty. We did have lots of indicators, but our numbers were pretty bleak. But it was important to say, but we cared so much about it that it led us to this third step, was really adapting our models to those particular things. But you know, that question is a second question that's very important in terms of how you would do that. And these became they're process questions. And whether you're a high resource nonprofit or a low resource nonprofits, it doesn't take a lot of resources to ask yourself these questions. You really just need to assemble that cross section of board leadership and direct line staff and have these questions. And then ultimately you end up with that 5, I'd say 5 to 9 outputs, indicators, or outcomes you want to measure. So let me stop there to see if there's, you know, questions or comments on that.
Yeah, Nick, I don't think we had people asking if more specifically how to practically measure impact, like what metrics to use, which I think you have been getting to and you might have more of later.
Yeah, so that will be the third step. I'll get others a little bit.
Yeah, and then we have, so the 3 to 9 can be any of outcome impact or outcome impact or outcomes, or maybe that meant output. Like when you're thinking about like, I think you had said how many.
Yeah, and that's just a recommendation. Again, you know, they've done this, we've done it for many times. It's just to say, if you come up with 50, most nonprofits do not have the capacity to measure 50 different things. It would be just too costly, mostly on the human resources side and technology based. But, you know, 3 to 5 becomes doable.
Yeah, I would also just add to, it's both a feasible question and it's also like, what is core to what you want to capture? And if you have many things, it's hard to focus on what's most important too. So,
Derek, you want to go to make your comment? I think your hand's raised. Oh, hold on. Yep, you need to unmute yourself.
I would just chime in that I'm going to touch on a bunch of different, oh, my video stuff. I'm going to touch on a couple of different things that nonprofits can measure simultaneously using technology in a little bit.
Nick, there's a question from Katie. Is there ever a danger to organizations limiting themselves by what they feel they can measure?
That probably is the case. And again, but you know, when we say we have to make hard choices, I think if we want to demonstrate our impact. And we had these debates back and forth. And again, we started with 89 and they're all very important. And in some cases, we were able to consolidate them to end up with the ones that we could measure. But, you know, the limit, you're not, in some cases, we still measured outputs or indicators in programs, but it was not an organizational, it did not feed into the organizational scorecard that helped the board govern, because they could really look at that. And, you know, the data that we used to then track it and form the programs, it was really, sometimes it's a choice of resources, but it's not to say those other measurements aren't that important. But the reality is, if you can't measure it, then you can't necessarily hold yourselves accountable to it. So it's not that it's not important, it's just a question of resources.
There's a question, Nick. Someone that works with a lot of sites that have to justify a business case to keep investment in their programs, and where do you find financial outcomes like reduction in cost, reduction in unnecessary utilization, and increase in revenue? Where does that fall within the theory of change?
So the two dashboards I'm going to show you are programmatic, and what we're not showing you is maybe an internal dashboard that measures sort of these financials, there's cases. But, you know, we would say that organizations should have two. One's external facing, is like, are you having the social impact you want? And then one's probably internal facing, or one more maybe funder facing, which is an internal dashboard of measuring financials, measuring staff attrition. But I think that's for a different presentation to kind of go into those particular things. But yeah, you could take it a next level and tie resources to impact. When you're really looking at social impact bonds, that's what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to say is like, let's create outcome measures, and then we need to tie those to financial resources. But that's a level that I don't necessarily think that kind of goes beyond this theory of change, but would be a very sophisticated level to say, can you tie a particular investment or a money amount to deliver a particular impact, but beyond most of nonprofits' resources.
So we have, Nick, there's a question about any measures for COVID-19 for thinking about the capturing outputs, any advice on that? And then there's another question about funding agencies who want you to measure outcomes that are very difficult to measure, or you don't find representing success as you would define it, and how to address that.
Anybody's welcome to jump into the outputs with impacts of COVID-19. I think that's too fresh, and I'm the nonprofit I run right now, which is more global. We don't, it's different. So somebody might be better qualified to answer that particular question than I am. For funding agencies, I mean, I think we all know that part of our process of leadership is not just always responding to funders, but educating funders. And often funders don't necessarily have this knowledge of theory of change or the organizational impacts. So and again, there's different types of funders. There's federal and governmental and state, and then there's foundations. So again, take this into context. Some are more flexible and some are not. But I would say if you have a really good theory of change and you have these impacts and you've gone through this process, you are more able to educate these funding agencies about what you can measure and what you can't, and why you need to do it in a particular way. And then ultimately, I think with that, oftentimes some of them will listen to you and then change their policies. It's not in all the cases, because I know some are, again, less flexible than others.
Nick, can I add one thing on that? Do you mind? So I also, I think this was an education person asking the question, and like the example of like academic achievement or graduation or something that's like in the long term, and running a program that's a shorter term program that may not be able to demonstrate impact on that in the like in the time frame that you have. And so one of the things we advise organizations to do is to think about what you can measure, your short-term outcomes, as leading indicators. Like, this is what we can measure, this is what we can show we're having an influence on, and then finding research that ties those measures to the longer-term outcomes, like academic achievement, for example. So if you're impacting having a child having a caring adult that is supportive of them, there's research out there that can show that then can support some longer-term outcomes. So it's kind of trying to use the theory of change to say, yes, those are our long-term outcomes, but here's the logic and here's the theory. Doesn't always work, right? Sometimes you still have to report on certain outcomes, but it can help, as Nick shared, using the theory of change to explain how your organization thinks about change over time. I've found can be effective for talking or to communicating with funders. So.
So assuming that you've taken your organization through this process and you've landed with 3, 5, 9 sort of outputs, indicators, or outcomes you're going to measure, and that's usually the hardest part of this work, is having those conversations with boards and leadership and coming to some type of agreement for that. But once you have that, then you can apply the type of outcome you want to those different things, which means how you're going to measure it. And so David Hunter, provides these categories and from easiest to hardest. At the very minimum, you can measure knowledge. So if somebody goes through a program, a pre and post test is very easy to measure. It's acquisition of information. Could be about parenting practices, nutrition, technology. That's the easiest to measure and easiest to change. A little bit harder is skills. Did you give somebody a new skill? Reading skills, math skills, work readiness skills, parenting skills. That's a little bit harder to measure. So you have to keep that in context of saying, what are you going to measure and what is your program aligned to actually do that? Changing attitude, as you can imagine, a little bit harder. The importance of education. We might have taught them how to read, but they still don't think education is important. Success at work, reading to one's children. So again, their attitude. Behavior makes it even harder. Our programs, it's like we all struggle with getting people to change their behavior. Eating nutritious food. We all know that eating is good and food is medicine, but getting people to do that, I can definitely be successful in knowledge, but if I can actually get people to stop buying fast food and eat an apple instead, that's very different, right? Change in achievement is better report card grades, improved standardized test scores, better work performance. Change in attainment would be like high school graduation, post-secondary education, and you see we're starting to move into outcomes. And then change in status would be now they're healthy. We've lowered their body mass index. They're being a student, they're no longer a dropout, they're a graduate, stuff like that. So again, once you have those, then you assign one of these and it knows a little bit about what you're going to measure. So I'm going to give you a little example of Congreso, and I love this case example because I left in 2010, and I go back to the website every once in a while, and I just check on their dashboard. And for the most part, it's almost exactly the same as we did 10 years ago, which says if you do this right, it will hold the test of time, and it gives the board again a social impact dashboard to really look at and then govern the organization. And I also say thanks to the Ed McConnell Clark Foundation because they paid for our theory of change, and but now it's like, okay, can we translate it to not everybody who has a large foundation supporting the process? But this is an example of sort of what they landed on, and this is their current one from July 1st to June 30th. It's right on their website, so if you want to see it, it's public information. But as you can see, is like we ended up narrowing it down to 4 types: education, employment, housing, and health. And then underneath those, we had different indicators of what we are going to do. So we did lump them into different groups, and then we, increased numeracy skills would have been a skill, increased literacy skills was a skill, and then obtained a GED. Well, that would have been a change in achievement or more an outcome. And we did that, and then we were able to measure it, right? When you look at the right hand, it says, well, are we publicly accountable to it? And it says, well, it doesn't look like a lot of numbers. They have another one that really talks about number of people they serve, but it shows that there's so much work that needs to go into this to help people achieve those. So, but it's a one-pager. It's a great thing. It's external facing. It's also board, and so then the board can actually use this and say, okay, if we're not reaching our particular goals, what can we do differently, or what does the data say? And we can dig into it to inform and maybe do the programs differently. Now, the other case example I wanted to use was I'm also on the board of the Free Library of Philadelphia, and they started a process too. And of course, I was fresh off of these theories of change and measuring outcomes, and we started applying some of those principles to the Free Library. But the Free Library kind of ended up taking a different stance because they're a different type of organization. But I also think it's acceptable not to always have direct indicators or outcomes or impact, and it's okay to measure outputs if you have a good theory behind it. So this is kind of an example of what the Free Library did. So they also grouped it into 4 primary categories: build a culture of literacy in Philadelphia, deliver an exceptional customer experience, embrace creativity, and promote diversity and inclusion. But as you can see, you know, they limited it to indicators to percentage of increase in visits. Well, that's an output. New cardholders, outputs. Program attendance, that's outputs. But again, a very different type of organization that they didn't necessarily need to deliver that because they have a different mission and they're a different type of organization. So I use those 2 examples to say either, in my book, either is acceptable just because of who you are. So, you know, well, I already kind of talked about this, but once you have these outcomes, then you start collecting data on this. And this leads a little bit into Morgan's. That data should inform your models, your programs. And sometimes what you realize is when you start tracking that is you're not reaching those outcomes, indicators, or outputs that you anticipated you would. So then, but then you can use that data to inform how do you actually change those programs, or how do you align those programs so that they're more likely to hit your organizational outcomes. So, you know, just a few final points, and then I think we might have a little more time for questions. As you know, the process I would say is just to remember, you know, start by assembling a cross section of your organization, brainstorm your outputs, indicators, outcomes, but then you have to narrow them down into measurable and accountable outputs, indicators, and outcomes. Assign the types of measurements, publish your scorecard, and then monitor the data that will inform your programs. And this is sort of an annual basis that you really go through over and over again. So why don't we, if you have questions, why don't you submit them in the chat box and I'll answer them while Morgan goes on, because we want to make sure we keep on track. So I'll turn it over to Morgan and I'll answer chat box questions. So Morgan?
Again. All right, let me share my screen. Okay. All right, everyone. Again, my name is Morgan Berman. I'm the founder and CEO of Milk Crate, and we're going to talk about mobile engagement and participant progress tracking for nonprofits, which I think I love the crescendo of these 3 presentations because it's really going to tie into measurement, outputs and outcomes, and goals. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover some common analog and digital engagement tools that some of you are probably already using today. We're going to talk about Milk Crate and how does it work, and specifically take a look at some case studies, including the Read by Fourth case study that Milk Crate built an app for and a couple of others. And then really kind of taking a high level view at when does it make sense to launch an app for a nonprofit program and when does it not? Because that's something that we as a company have learned over the years working with dozens of organizations, when you should or should not do this, because there are definitely indicators in both directions. So my background, like I said, I'm the founder of the company, but I'm also deeply involved still in the nonprofit world. I work as the volunteer president of the neighborhood civic association that I live in. I'm also on the board of directors for Philly Startup Leaders, the OMLINK's Philadelphia chapter, and the Energy Coordinating Agency here in Philadelphia. I mentioned that my background was in the nonprofit world. I used to work at Planned Parenthood and a few other organizations focused on maternal health and well-being. And so I'm still happily involved in the nonprofit world, just kind of from the perspective of from the company perspective. And I do Habero Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to relieve stress and have fun and get out of the office normally, but now I'm doing it in my closet room upstairs. All right. So first chat question, who here is running a program for volunteers, beneficiaries, members, or others at a nonprofit and wishes engagement and progress tracking was easier? And just, yeah. See, there's my chat window. Yep, Robin said me. And feel free to say what the program is. We're also going to touch on in a little bit. I'm going to ask some questions about like what specific challenges are you having, but I just want to get a feel for, yes, Kai, Natalie, yeah, everyone's like, yes, that's a thing that we struggle with. All right, so here are some tools, and I've divided this from the blue are the analog kind of old school tools, and then we've got the purple, which are the kind of more modern technical digital ones. And so there's a wide range of these that you might be using. And you might be using a combination of them. You may have used some and then ditched some for others. So I'm curious, which of these tools are you using and how well is it serving your needs now? Which do you love and wish you could dump yesterday? Oh, cool. Kai's doing wildlife rehabilitation. That's wonderful. Google Drive a lot, Google Forms. Yep. Yeah, I'll go back to that slide. Absolutely. Oops. There we go. So yeah, we've got like snail mail, paper client files. I used to use those. Phone calls, sign-in clipboards are a really common one, and one that Milk Crate's always helping our clients get rid of. Same with binders and guides, where you've got like a physical directory of resources. ID cards are one where you have to like present something to check in. Smart sheets, sign-in clipboards, yeah, CRM, touchscreen, yeah, and social media. I mean, what a blessing and a curse, right? I mean, you've got such a powerful tool, but unless you pay to reach your audience, you're only going to capture maybe 1 to 5% of your audience is going to see something that you post. So it's not a guaranteed method of direct communication. Yeah, and email, we all know about those spam filters. Okay, cool, let's move on. Thank you all for sharing. All right, so now that we've kind of talked about the old school stuff and some of the more modern stuff, building on that idea of modern tools and innovation for nonprofit tech, Milk Crate. So what is Milk Crate? It's an affordable and fast way to launch your nonprofit program's app for your audience, choosing from ready-to-go features that match your engagement tracking needs. And so that's all on the app side, and then managing your users and your content and generating activity reports using the admin dashboard that comes with it. So it's kind of like the two parts, and you're seeing that on your screen here. You've got your iPhone app or your Android app. It can be launched to both. And then the admin dashboard on the computer where you can manage your app, see what your users are doing, create new activities, content, events, poll questions. All that good stuff can happen from here, and then it shows up in your app. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But first, I want to kind of go over, this is how we kind of see nonprofit programs moving through their life cycle. The very first stage is enlisting people to get them in the door, right? Sign up to be a volunteer, sign up for this program, those sorts of actions. And then the next step is, how do you engage them? Get them to sign up for another shift, get them to learn more, get them to want to enroll in the next course, evaluating them. How many hours did you log? How consistent were you at showing up? Did you complete all the assignments? Did you achieve the goal that you set out to achieve when you enrolled in the program? And endorse is the last stage, where typically you're both acknowledging the success of the program participant or the volunteer, but maybe also getting the endorsement from your stakeholders, your funders, showing them the good work that you did and saying, here's the report, here's the impact we made, now keep funding us so we can keep doing it and maybe even grow it. Milk Crate, our actual technology and what we help nonprofits do is better do the engage and evaluate part. That's where we really focus, using mobile technology that we use or build with our platform. But both of those other, the first and the last phase, are things that we're also very cognizant of and how we can help support that. So this is one of our clients, Diego from Inner City Capital Connections. We just had this call a few weeks ago when he was telling me, you know, in the context of COVID, we now more than ever needed an engagement platform. How nice that we already had a digital one. So now that they can no longer do all of their trainings and programs in person, having something in place where they can send communication directly to program participants, engage them and track them right on their phones has been really important to them, maintaining the level of involvement that they wanted to. Obviously, in these unforeseen circumstances, that was, you know, a huge benefit, but it's something that has been serving them for the almost 2 years, I think, that they've been working with us. So a typical user experience, if you're trying to engage program participants and collect that data about what they're doing in your program, is they download the app, they create a profile, and this is a really important opportunity to collect information like demographic information, and something that is really unique to a mobile app versus maybe just a static website or some other form of information like a Facebook social media post. You're not going to necessarily see things like their age, their race, their gender, their zip code, the kind of things that they're asked to complete when they create a profile on an app, and that you can then use that information as filtering for when you do data analytics on the platform as well. The next step is often choosing a segment. So are you a volunteer in the Northeast or in West Philadelphia? Are you a seventh, or let's say a 10th grader versus a 12th grader? Or are you, you know, different roles within the organization might have different content that they are engaging with in the app. And then finally, earning points, doing activities, progressing, completing challenges. And all of those can take a lot of different forms. We have templated features pre-built, and this is how we're able to do this quickly and affordably, is that you have an events calendar that's already ready-made, where you can have volunteer shifts or learning opportunities that you schedule. People can sign up for them. You can have a cap for how many people can sign up. They can get reminders. They can post comments about the experience they had. They can physically check in on their phone, and it will verify through GPS that they were there at that time, which is a really great way to have verified data about participation. Push notifications when you have something in the app that you want people to see, that you are really emphasizing at a particular time, being able to send that push notification right to their phone and having it open up that activity or piece of content in their phone immediately without having to click through. That really helps increase engagement. We have a directory and map that you can use in a bunch of different ways. Oh, wow, this is remarkable. Thanks, John. Keep those comments coming. We've got polls and surveys. That's a really engaging way to capture people's like interest in something, their desire for something, their perspective on something, and doing it in little bits and pieces. It can happen on an ongoing basis. So you don't have to just do a pre and post survey, 6 months apart. People can earn points on their app for answering a question every day or every week. And we have clients that do that because people love to share their opinion. We all have seen that on Twitter, right? So this can be a kind of more fun, wholesome way of capturing people's opinions or interests and using that data to help fuel your program and your evaluation of it. Like I mentioned earlier in the user onboarding, is segmenting your users into different groups. And then obviously being able to share content. One of the most common ones is like having a resource library. Read by Fourth is definitely one of the examples that I'll go over that used that feature. I'm going to pause there. Actually, let me go back. I know I just spoke a lot. Any questions or anything I should touch on so far? And you're not seeing the little chat window that I have on my screen, right? I just wanted to make sure I'm not blocking the slides.
You can see your slides.
Okay, great. That's awesome that I can see both. Okay.
So Morgan, I would say that, when we first went through Congress and we had to figure out technology to do this, we were sort of at the front end of actually helping efforts to outcomes where the technology go through this. And people always ask me, like, if you were to do it differently, who would you pick? And I would say that I wish you were around way back then. We ended up spending so much money, both in staff resources, but also in the development of just figuring out how to measure a complex organization and all the data right around. Yeah. And so I always tell Milk Crate is that solution that really is cost effective, but yet it's so much user and friendly too. So of all the software projects, although I personally haven't engaged in Milk Crate because I haven't had an organization to put all this data into, I wish I could go back 10 years, bring you back with us, and the world would probably look like a very different place. So I would just say that to all the listeners.
Thanks so much, Nick. I really appreciate that. I had a discovery call with an organization a few weeks ago. They told me they'd spent something like $200,000 building something from scratch, and it was almost identical to Milk Crate. And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry I didn't know you 4 years ago. But yeah, there are a lot of organizations out there that are trying to build stuff from scratch if they're lucky enough to get a grant that big, but usually it's just way too expensive to try and build something from scratch, which is why, again, this slide says templated features. We're not building an events calendar from scratch every single time we launch a Milk Crate app. The events calendar and the Read by Fourth app is the same events calendar code in the We Vote app as in the Mighty Writers app, in the Hungry Harvest app. Like all of our events calendars, all the poll questions, it's the same templated feature. So it makes it so much faster and cheaper to launch something like this. Robin asked a question, do participants pay for Milk Crate? No, the way that we work is we partner with nonprofits that pay for the service of launching a Milk Crate app that's their brand, their content, their users, for their audience. We also actually partnered with foundations, and this kind of touches on something that Nick was talking about earlier, is when funders want to see impact and they want to help with capacity. We've actually gotten several foundations to commit to funding apps for their grantees. So we'll work directly with a nonprofit, or we'll work with a foundation to then get to work directly with a nonprofit. But typically there's no need to charge your program participants, and that's typically going to be an unwanted barrier. We have a couple of social enterprises that use a Milk Crate app to run their program. They're not nonprofits, and the people that they're serving are not like a disadvantaged or like underserved population, and they are actually exploring charging for their apps, but that's a pretty different use case than nonprofits and what we're talking about. Does Milk Crate's downloaded sample app offer some perhaps minimum set of tools a low budget nonprofit can see that might be done? Okay, so we're getting kind of into the demo question, and so we'll be sending out, I'm going to send out an email to all of the people that registered after this, offering if you would like to see a demo and get a deeper dive into how Milk Crate works, we will set that up so that you and I can spend 30 minutes kind of going over this stuff. We do have a demo app and things like that that we can walk through together, but we'll follow up with that and we can talk about that. Okay, and yes, there is a range of fees. We do a sliding scale, so that makes it so that we can work with a very wide range of organizations, from really tiny ones to really big ones, really underfunded ones to really well-funded ones. So yeah, that's part of our mission, is to be able to serve every nonprofit that wants to work with us. Okay, so the next question, what engagement or tracking problems are you currently experiencing? And then I added working remotely might be a particularly new challenge that you might be experiencing with your members, volunteers, students, or beneficiaries. And I'll just talk about an example of another client. The Youth Volunteer Corps is one of our clients, and they typically use their Milk Crate app to provide volunteer opportunities to their youth that then sign up for that opportunity, track their experience all in their app. Now, those volunteer experiences are obviously, everything that they had been doing are suspended because they were all in person. They've then transitioned all of their experiences to be digital service work that the kids can do. So things like sending e-cards to families with someone's recovering from cancer, or doing a plastic audit in their home. So they've found activities that the teens can keep doing and keep kind of building experience doing that good work while still at home. So if anyone else wants to share any engagement or tracking problems in the chat, feel free to go ahead and do that. Okay. So I mentioned WeVote. This is another, I'm going to do some case studies just to kind of get the wheels turning a little bit more about seeing if this might be something that could be useful. So the Committee of 70 runs a program called WeVote. It's an opportunity for businesses to actually partner with this nonprofit so that their employees can be more civically engaged. And we basically transformed this whole program by launching an app where all the content, volunteer opportunities, education, surveys, all of that now lives in this app. And each employer that signs up has their own team. And so they're earning points as a team as well as individually for signing up to run the polls, or for downloading the voter guide, or watching videos of candidates, things like that. And so their goal is to really just cultivate a culture of civic participation in voting in Philadelphia. And we've been really thrilled to support that with Milk Crate. Now, an example of outputs versus outcomes, I wanted to kind of touch on this because I knew this is something that Nick and Claire are really wonderful at talking about. So in the context of, say, a WeVote-like scenario, an outcome, I should have labeled this, or sorry, an output on the left is there were 450 instances of voters viewing the voter guide this election cycle in the app. So that's like an output, a number of things that happened kind of in a discrete measurement. Now, the outcome that we're hoping to achieve is app users were 50% more likely to vote after downloading the app at least 1 week before the election. And these are both examples of things that we can actually measure using a Milk Crate app, right? Like how many users open the voter guide in the app, we can measure that, but then we can also measure check-ins at the polls or self-reported voting in a poll question, and what the delta looks like if they did that within a certain time period of downloading the app. So those are all the kinds of data questions that our clients are always asking, or that we're helping them think to ask when it comes to outputs and outcomes, and how they can use something like an app to start measuring that and reporting on it, often in a very verified way. Gamification of engagement, absolutely, that is what we're all about. Now, this one is foundations and their reporting expectations. So often, you've got foundations thinking, well, we'll give you funding, you're going to go do good work, and that's going to lead to outputs, outcomes, and impacts, right? And that it's just going to be this really neat, simple equation. And it can be, but rarely is it that easy. And I'm curious to hear from you all. How many of your funders have asked for program data, impact data, progress reports, and you then experience some sort of barrier collecting that data, often in a timely or accurate way, right? Like, how am I ever supposed to know what happened with that cohort from 6 months ago, or what their thoughts were, or what they accomplished when we had hundreds of them, or something like that? So what kind of barriers, what kind of expectations have you experienced, and might something like this have been able to make a difference? That's one of the things that we're really always trying to help with, is having that dashboard where all of your user data is just right there in real time, so that if a funder says, how many people did blank last month, you can just take a screenshot and send it to them in an email without having to do any extra work. Or if they say, we'd love to know blank moving forward, then you can, use our system to start measuring that as well. Okay, looks like no one's either are tired or don't have any examples, so we'll just skip to the next one. Now, like I said, this is kind of what we're hoping to achieve, and what we've been able to deliver for a lot of our clients has been this idea that funders give money to a nonprofit program. That program can use Milk Crate to design and launch an app for their program participants. Those program participants engage by completing activities, things that can lead to both an output or an outcome, or both. And then that data shows up on a dashboard that can then be reported back to funders. And this is the kind of virtuous cycle we're hoping to create through funding nonprofit activities in their programs with their participants, and the data that the app can generate about that. Okay. Who is wondering what the accessibility of mobile is to different demographic audiences? Is there a magic bullet for reaching everyone with one tool? I'm not even going to bother asking. I'm sure you guys are all thinking about that. So here's some really important Pew data from 2019. Americans of all ages are increasingly likely to say that they mostly go online using their smartphone. You can see this is broken down by ages. So obviously the older the group gets, the lower it is. But you can see the trend line is quite clear for all US adults in all age ranges, and that particularly in the under 50, it's at least something like 50% or more are relying on their phones. And then over here on the right-hand side, the majority of Americans have a smartphone. So you can look at this, all these age, race, education, income, and geography breakdowns. The vast majority of every single group are using a smartphone. So if you ever have wondered to yourself, are my people using a smartphone? Yes, they are. All right, so let's get into a few more case studies. So we talked about the Read by Fourth. So we built an app for the Reading Captains program. And this is, just a quick case study about how we did that. And basically the Reading Captains were given a binder of all the materials that they needed to go out into the community and share to help promote literacy, to get kids on grade reading level. And that was a big binder for them to carry around. And then trying to collect the information around what are they doing, what's going well, what isn't, was another kind of laborious task on the staff. And so now with the Read by Fourth app, the resources are all in their phone wherever they go. So whenever they're talking to a family, they can quickly pull up the information they need to share, and then they can document the experience of what it was like sharing that information, what the family got out of it, any challenges they had. And there's a lot of knowledge sharing amongst the volunteers through the app, which has been really wonderful to see. There's a whole activity feed where you can see in real time the photos, the comments, everything that the volunteers are doing, showing up and populating that feed. The STAMP program, the Cultural Alliance runs an initiative called the STAMP program, where teens can go to museums for free. They used to have to rely on a paper ID card to check in. Now the kids check in on their phones, and they instantly get verified that they're at that location, and the pass pops up on their phone, and the admissions desk lets them into the museum. And then they can see in real time the data around how many teens are going to which museums and when. And you can see some screenshots of some of those charts here. Visits to the Franklin Institute were very popular in January, as was the PMA. And Michael Norris, who used to run that program, was a really great champion for this, and it was a really great fit. So just to kind of go over some of the bullet points here and getting into when does an app make sense. So apps are valuable when there's a goal to better engage your program participants and track data. That's number one. Needs to be a value to the users where they complete activities, consume content, can communicate in a way that was easier and more rewarding than they used to be able to do. So it has to be an upgrade for them. The gamification can certainly help make it more fun, but it also has to be useful or interesting to them. And we kind of touched on that. The value to the staff, it has to be something that helps the staff do their jobs more easily as well. This has to be seen as something that helps them eliminate something that used to be ineffective or time sucking, and help them get the results that they're looking for. And same for the funders. They want to be able to see that transparent success data as well. Now, this is a chart I made to just really simply summarize when does an app make sense. If you need consistent engagement with your audience and you need that behavior data or that progress data on an ongoing basis, that's when an app makes sense. If you don't need that, if you don't need behavior data, if you don't need consistent engagement, then maybe a one-time survey or a website, depending on the situation, can make sense. And so we kind of do a whole discovery process with any nonprofit that we talk to kind of figure out where on this chart they fall, so that they can kind of figure out whether or not it makes sense to work with us. So getting towards the end, who has explored an app before and found that it was going to be too much time, money, or beyond their expertise? And Nick kind of let the cat out of the bag on this one, that we are obviously a much more affordable, faster way of doing this than what used to be available 3, 5, 10 years ago. But I'm curious if any of you have ever looked into building an app, particularly from scratch, and seen the often 6-figure price tag that can come from that. Okay. So we already kind of know where this is going, but typically Milk Crate is something like 1/10 of what it would cost to do this from scratch. We do operate on a sliding scale, and we do not charge a whole large lump sum up front and then walk away. It's much more an ongoing relationship where we're committed to helping you succeed over the long haul, and our business model reflects that. We're also designed specifically for nonprofits' unique needs and developed the right templated features to solve them. Milk Crate is only designed to help nonprofits. We're not working with giant corporations and all these other types of groups that, you know, we have in the past. We realized that we wanted to specifically serve nonprofits, and that's where we focus all of our energy. And that makes it so that we can launch something quickly in weeks or months instead of years. And you're supported that whole time through a client support specialist who helps make sure that you have the understanding of the platform and how to use it every step of the way. So we work with a wide range of organizations now: civic organizations, volunteer programs, education and training, social services, youth groups, membership programs, really broad range of nonprofits, some really wonderful success stories in all of these. If you see yourself reflected in some of these case studies of what might be for your organization, I'd urge you to get in touch. We will be sending out an email where you'll have my contact information and have an opportunity to have a discovery call to see if this is something that could help you with your organization's impact and measuring it and growing it over time. So that's the end of the actual slides for the presentation, we can absolutely do some more Q&A. If you would like a copy of the actual PDF of the slides, there is a form that we're going to send out a survey. The URL is right here, but we'll also send out in an email. And anyone who fills out the feedback survey will get the PDF. So that's my little engagement strategy so that we can make sure that we're constantly improving our presentation. So thank you all so much. And yeah, let's do any more Q&A.
So yeah, so this part is we're just open to any additional questions that anybody might want to ask any of us.
Morgan, there's a question, can Milk Crate be built for bilingual communities?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So sorry, I need to just take a sip of water.
Okay.
We have some very basic navigation that's built in English, but all the content can be written in any language you want. And you can create teams for different languages in the app. So you could have like an experience for your Spanish speaking population or your, Chinese speaking population, whatever language you're wanting to write your content in, we can just create a different team for that. And again, I will send out an email with the survey link, and then you'll have my contact information. And anyone who's interested in working with Impact Ed or Milk Crate, you will have a chance to get in touch with us and set up a discovery call. So don't worry about that, and we can do that at a non-dinner time.
So if there's no more questions, Natalie, would you like to take it back for Venture Cafes?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys so much for your presentation. That was wonderful, all really great information. And thank you everyone for joining us. In terms of what we have going on for the rest of the evening, I'll put these links in the chat, but we have a social networking cafe space that takes place on a platform called Remo. And then we also have here in Philadelphia, a poetry slam coming up at 6:45. So I'll put the links for both of those in the chat. But otherwise, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. And we hope to see you at a future event.
Thank you all for joining and your great questions throughout.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And Morgan, are you going to send an email to everybody? Because there's some people have to leave, so they'll get it in email, I believe. You're still on mute. I think that's a yes. So you'll get an email so you can fill out the survey. So
bye everyone.
have a nice evening.
Have a nice evening.